institutions in the world, so that all that exists is globalization, right? That global capitalism influences all nations, right? And really what end up happening is that your sovereignty will be under, again, this is really conceptual now, and this is way too, I'm not going to explain it, I'm just going to say it, but national sovereignty would be challenged by a refusal to enter the global economy. As example, in Cuba, economic sanctions have more power than you could ever believe, right? They are the death blow. You don't participate in the global economy, you don't exist. That's basically what it is, right? And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I don't actually believe that you don't exist. But the point is, global capitalism is that powerful. You are either with us or you're not, because there isn't another economic, there are other social, there are other political, but there isn't another economic paradigm, right? There isn't. All right, next, human rights and globalization. And top of page 6, human rights and globalization. Let's look at that. Number 1, so this is human rights and globalization, and number 1. Top of page 6, there is an attempt to assess whether globalization is good or bad for human rights, right? We're trying to determine whether globalization is a good thing or it's a bad thing for human rights, right? So we're attempting to determine the nature of the relationship between globalization and human rights. So we're attempting to determine the nature of the relationship between globalization and human rights. Turn off my phone. Come on. Okay. And that's what we're trying to say. Is globalization a good thing? Is globalization a bad thing? Let's make an assessment. Next, this question is ill-formed. It is irrelevant. The question is the kinds of changes that globalization will likely cause, right? So the attempt to try and determine the nature of globalization, is globalization good, is globalization bad, is a flawed question. The question is inherent, argue some. The question is inherently flawed. The question is inherently irrelevant. Why? Because the interpretation of good and bad are qualitative assessments, subjective assessments, and thus sort of not really the best qualitative analytic approach to assessing the relationship between globalization and human rights. Because what you view as good, others might view as bad. So number 2 says, in point 2, what we're recognizing is the process of assessing the relationship between globalization and human rights is to remedy some of the dangers, right? Is to remedy some of the dangers that global economic system causes, right? So when we're talking about globalization on the one hand and human rights on the other, what we need to do is we recognize that there is a possibility and really a likelihood for human rights violations, and we try to stop the likelihood for human rights violations, right? There's a possibility, there's a likelihood for human rights violations with respect to the relationship between globalization and human rights, and we try to stop those human rights violations. This is where it gets, now, me personally, I don't really do human rights theory proper. Obviously, I believe in human rights, but my discussion and my sort of contribution to the world is more about genocide. But you can imagine that a young, sort of up-and-coming human rights theorist might want to make sense of how do I alleviate the possibility for human rights violations between globalization and human rights? I'm going to give you a word of advice, young scholars, from someone who has looked into the abyss for a long time. You cannot truly offer any good, any viable contribution to protecting individuals who will likely be targeted and exploited by the spread of global capitalism if you don't think like a global capitalist. Who can I exploit? How can I exploit them? What resources can I extract? How can I extract those resources and circumvent political regulations to protect environment and protected populations and so on? And I'm not saying that those people actually exist, but you need to become the boogeyman. If you really want to protect human beings from human rights violations, you need to think like they think. And there might not even be a person in the world that thinks as diabolical as you, but you need to think like that in order to recognize conceptually the vulnerabilities, right? Where is an individual the weakest? I need to think, well, what is weak about this community? What is weak about that population? How could I conceptually extract as much money from this population as possible? And once you start to conceptualize in those terms, you will see where the vulnerabilities are within the population. It is in the recognition of those vulnerabilities that then you do your grassroots work. You try as best as possible to protect the communities, right? But you can't protect the communities until you recognize, at least conceptually, where they're the weakest. For me, as a genocide scholar, this means that I really have to think about how you systematize the process of killing people. And I have to be really, really good at systematizing how that's done. Insofar as I can do that successfully and recognize how that process is operationalized, then you can take that information to protect those populations. Here are warning signs. Here's how you go about not being targeted and so on, right? So for you up-and-coming theorists, especially those of you who are going to spend your life doing human rights, trust me on this. It might not hit you until years after you start your career. And it would be awesome. There's nothing greater than me thinking that I'm going to help educate the next generation of human rights and peace activists. But trust me, prepare yourself mentally for the arduous process of thinking about protecting human beings' rights. Because the corresponding notion is you're only going to be good at your job if you can think about ways in which human rights are violated, right? So to protect human rights, you need to think about how they're violated. To talk about the relationship between globalization and human rights, you need to think about the most diabolical aspects of globalization and create that structure of the most exhaustively evil system of manipulation, of exploitation, and then try to create a structure to defend, to protect from that, right? So that's really what we're attempting to do, right? So it's not about good and bad, right? It's not about good and bad. Argue some. To remedy some of the dangers of global economic system is what is at stake here, right? What can we do to prevent the system that's already in place from possibly, likely abusing human rights? That's the question. Number 3. So this is where Karl Polanyi's discourse comes in. I actually want to read some from the book. Again, I'm using this book, Human Rights in the World Community. It's a phenomenal text. I'm going to use just this book alone for the entirety of the Human Rights lecture. And to be honest with you, as I was going through this, I already know that this Human Rights lecture is going to be long. I'm 4 hours into the lecture now, and I have a lot to go. I'm only on page 6. So I'm probably going to extend and do another account of human rights. But let's see what Karl Polanyi has to say, right? So I'm reading on page 54, third paragraph in the text. Karl Polanyi wrote The Great Transformation to explain the economic, social, and political changes that occurred in Europe, particularly Britain from the end of the 18th century to the Second World War. This was a period of about 160 years, known to have radically transformed the way people live. Radically transformed the way people lived. So what we want to do is we want to make sense of a radical